Welcome back to part 2 of my chat with renowned photojournalist Andrew Quilty. In part 1, we learnt a lot about Andrew, but also about his relationship with the people of Afghanistan. In part 2, we're going to talk to Andrew, who is one of the few journalists brave enough, or stupid enough, to be in Kabul when the government forces capitulated to the Taliban. Welcome back, Andrew.
Thanks, Gary.
Now, just to give people a little bit of a history lesson, because it's about 12 months ago that this occurred, August the 15th. But in researching for the podcast, I found something that you had posted, and I'll just read it out because I think it summarised what was going on. So this is a Instagram message that you posted on the 15th of August 2021. Yesterday, after 19 years and 10 months, the US-led war in Afghanistan came to an end. US President Joe Biden announced the final withdrawal of American forces in April. When the withdrawal began on May the 1st, the Taliban commenced a countrywide offensive, taking control of 90% of Afghanistan in months. On August the 6th, they overran their first provincial capital. 32 others fell within the next 10 days, leaving Kabul, the capital, surrounded. Yesterday, an agreement was reached which saw the government hand power to the former insurgent group and the former President Ghani flee with his wife and close aides to a country to the north. For approximately 12 hours, neither the former government security forces nor the Taliban controlled the streets of Kabul. American helicopters ferried thousands of embassy staff to the airport and waiting military aircraft day and night. Hundreds queued to withdraw money from banks. In the city's west, however, a number of Taliban fighters made victory laps to crowds of cheering residents and passers-by. So that was the environment you flew into.
Yeah, I flew in the day before, actually, the afternoon of the 14th of August. And at that point, we still didn't really know what was going to happen.
Yeah.
We knew the Taliban were pretty close to the outskirts of Kabul, and that they were going to start threatening pretty soon. The mood inside Kabul was very tense. There were huge crowds outside banks of account holders trying to withdraw all their savings. A lot of people had come in from the outlying provinces ahead of the Taliban advance and were camped out in public parks and things. And there was, a lot of trepidation about what was to come. It was probably two ways it could have gone from this point. It could have seen a return to the civil war of the 1990s, where you had, at the time, the rebel forces besieging the Afghan capital, Kabul, whose soldiers were defending it from the inside, and the city was shelled relentlessly for several years and reduced to rubble. So there was a chance that could have happened again with the Taliban this time and the Ashraf Ghani's government forces defending. Or it could have happened, as it did in the end, that the government and its security forces just disintegrated.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what happened the next day. We woke up that morning, as I said, really unsure what was going to happen. We'd heard that we'd heard rumours that the main prison in the city with several thousand Taliban fighters had been liberated, and we'd heard that the largest city in the east of the country, Jalalabad, had been overrun by the Taliban, and that represented the last major city for them to take before they could enter Kabul or at least come to the outskirts of Kabul from the east. They were already making their way up from the south and the north, and so everyone was really just holding their breath. I had booked a couple of commercial flights the night before just to have in my back pocket. I still wasn't really sure what I was going to do, but I wanted to have them in case they were necessary. And one of them was for the following day, the 16th. And of course, as I spoke about in the first part, to get on an international flight in 2021, you needed a negative PCR test. So one of the first things I did on August 15 was go to a health clinic nearby with a friend of mine who also had a ticket to get swabbed for COVID. And it was when we left that health clinic, walking back to home, that we heard some distant gunshots, and a flood of people running down the street towards us, and cars that were driving towards the center of the city, turning around in the middle of the street and heading back the opposite direction. And people were saying, the Taliban are here, the Taliban are here.
Yeah.
And so that was the point. That was about 11:30 that morning that things really started to go downhill. And it turned out that those gunshots and similar events were happening all around Kabul at around the same time, were actually just bank security guards who were trying to control the crowds outside. But for those who weren't aware of that, tension was so high that they immediately assumed that it was the Taliban. And so everyone started running for home. Police started stripping off their uniforms and getting into civilian clothes and blending in with the crowds.
Yeah.
Other security forces, soldiers and other branches of the military started to do the same. You started seeing soldiers abandoning their vehicles in the middle of the streets, leaving the keys in and just dispersing into the crowd.
So in that environment, your imagination would play havoc on what is potentially coming. Now, we talked about the Doha Agreement, and there was some basis for the Taliban to come across as the good guys whilst that was in place. But once the forces that you talk about, the government forces, the Americans have left, government forces are capitulating, anything was possible.
It was. It wasn't really the Taliban fighters that I was most worried about at this point. It was more the lawless period that might come in between.
Right.
Where you had no police in control of the streets anymore, nor did you have, nor would you have had for a time the Taliban to fill that void.
Yeah.
So you would have, looters and thieves and, rapists and murderers, especially after all these prisons
have been emptied.
Yep.
Yep.
Walking the streets with no one to stop them.
And as a foreigner too, it makes it more difficult to blend in.
Yeah, very much so. And as a foreigner, you're a lot more vulnerable for several reasons, because it's automatically assumed that you are wealthy.
Yep.
And that there's also a lot of animosity towards towards foreigners on this day, as 99% of the foreigners were abandoning the country. Any who were left behind, voluntarily or not, would potentially going to come in for scrutiny from Afghans.
Well, I suppose that the people that supported the foreigners, when the foreigners just left and left them to the mercy of whatever was to occur, I can understand resentment towards foreigners. Like you being a foreigner would represent a lot of things that people could be angry at.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I understood it for sure. And I'd never felt it like I did that day. And so it definitely impacted the way I acted, particularly that day, and moved around the city. I would wear local Afghan clothes in the past when I would go into the provinces, but very rarely in Kabul. That day I did, and made extra efforts to try and blend in. But that becomes more difficult again when you have a camera on your shoulder. Yeah. It was on the one hand I was just sort of trying to get through the day and trying to sort out things with friends who were making early efforts to try and get out of the country, with the staff at my house who were very scared about being associated with foreigners.
See, there is so many layers there, Andrew, isn't there? Because the people that you had close to you, the Afghanis, they were at risk because they were associated with you.
Exactly. Yeah. And it didn't. No one really knew to what extent an association would put you at risk at this point.
Yeah.
There was a bit of a hierarchy of association. At the top of that were interpreters who'd worked with foreign military.
Yep.
And all the way down to perhaps the guy who managed my house. For a bunch of civilian journalists, and no one was really sure how acute the risk was for someone like him, but nor did anyone want to take any risks.
Yeah.
So he told me, it got to midday that day, and he said, "I'm going to go home to my family," and we really didn't know what was going to happen at that point. There was no one really knew what was going to happen at the airport, or whether there was going to be any sort of evacuation or means for any of these people to get out at this point. And so, I sent him home with a bunch of, a wad of cash that we had in the safe at home, unsure when I'd see him again. It was very tense and emotional. And, I think we're all pretty worried at that point. Particularly, as I said before, because at this point we're in this kind of lawless stage where everyone was very vulnerable. There was no one had the protection of a government that had a motivation to be seen to be applying law and order in a country. There was no. If the Taliban had come in, there would be no benefit for them to have had news of widespread raping and looting under their watch.
Yeah.
So my hope at that point was that there would be as little as possible delay in the Taliban actually coming into the
Well, there's iconic images of them in the presidential palace. That was very early in the piece too, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was the night of the 15th of August.
Yeah.
At which point there weren't actually that many Taliban in the city. It got to a point late that afternoon where the Taliban and the US, high-level Taliban and US officials were in contact, arguing over who should take control of security of Kabul.
Yeah.
And the American general in charge in Afghanistan at the time said, "My orders are to protect the airport. Kabul is yours."
Right.
And so, obviously, the airport is within Kabul, so it was it set off a very sort of bizarre chain of events and circumstances in the Kabul. But sure enough, the orders came from the Taliban leadership in Doha for their military commanders to enter Kabul after being poised on the outskirts that evening, and to take control of the city and to secure the streets and secure the government buildings and banks and prisons and things.
What was your experience? Did you come across the Taliban when you were out and about in those early days, and did they question you or?
So late that afternoon on the 15th, I got on my motorcycle with a friend, an American photographer friend who was staying at the house with me, and we just got on the bike and to drive around and see what we could see. This was at the point where this was during that sort of lawless period. But we thought, okay, we'll get on the bike, we'll be maneuverable, we'll be able to get out of trouble if we get into trouble. Let's just go and have a look. And after about an hour of driving around some pretty empty streets, most people were just sort of hiding at home at this point with their families. We drove out towards the edge of the city, on the southern edge of the city, and we saw a crowd of people gathered round. It looked like a traffic jam, and we got a little closer, and there were a crowd of people around a motorcycle with two guys on it, and looked a little closer. And I said to Victor, my mate on the bike, I said, "They're Talibs."
Yeah. One
of them had an AK-47 resting on his knee on the back, and the other had a big long beard and sunglasses, and they were unmistakably Taliban.
Yeah.
And so I said, let's go over, let's go see him. So we parked the bike and walked over and just acted confidently like we were meant to be there, which we definitely weren't. And said, asked, can we take some photos? And people were gathering around them, taking selfies with them, and then, they sped off after a minute or two, and we sort of gave chase and eventually ran into another traffic jam where there were several cars and an American-made armoured Humvee, on top of which were piled like a dozen Taliban fighters, all holding automatic weapons, rocket-propelled grenades and machine guns, carrying Taliban flags and being cheered on by the crowds around them, and so we, it was pretty dicey. We really didn't know how we would be received. We were very vulnerable.
It's really putting your toe in the water to find out.
Yeah. But again, we just tried to ingratiate ourselves with the crowd. Like, so we tried to blend in. We were smiling and trying to be a part of this moment that was happening in front of us, and not to stand out, not to make ourselves out as enemies or
scared
others
of them or trying to get away from them.
Yeah, the best defense you have in that situation is a big smile and good positive body language, and that's what we did. And these Talibs probably thought, like,
who are these
guys
idiots?
Are nuts, like we're not going to screw with them. So and so we photographed them for a couple of minutes as they drove through the crowd, before we couldn't keep up with them anymore. And then we sort of wound our way through the back streets trying to get away from the crowds, and got back on the bike and headed for home. And we kind of played it pretty safe that night, because it was very hard to work out who was in control where, and anyone on the streets would have been pretty trigger happy, and so we kind of hunkered down a bit that night.
Well, that's the thing. You can have all the structure in the place, but this is the Wild West at this particular point in time, and mob rule, and even the people that were supporting the foreigners, it's in their vested interest to do what you did and support the Taliban now.
Absolutely.
And hey, we've Taliban yesterday, Taliban forever type situation. And I can imagine that would play a part of it. There's some people that you've mentioned in the book, and I just want to touch on a couple of them. And one was, and I've got it down here just in notes, a courageous woman, but Nadia, that you met before this happened, just in a brief exchange where she provided you images from a phone, and she reached out to you. Tell us a little bit about her story. It's contained in your book, because I think that it really touched me, like emotionally, what that poor woman had to go through.
Yeah, we met actually a couple of days after the Taliban came into Kabul. She was waiting outside an embassy where it was hoped people could, if they were able to enter, they would be taken from there to the airport. And so she was waiting outside there in the vain hope that she would be among those. And it wasn't, I had no idea at the time why she felt she needed to get out of the country. She actually introduced herself to me. I was out the front of this embassy trying to take some photographs, and the Taliban there kind of pulled me aside and sat me down and were asking me questions and demanding I delete photos, and just giving me the kind of treatment that was becoming pretty common at this point in those days. And unbeknownst to me, Nadia was in this crowd, and she was filming this exchange between me and the Taliban. Yeah. And, which would have caused a lot of problems for her if she'd been caught by the Taliban. And after I was let go, I walked back to my motorcycle, and then I heard this little voice. It was Nadia, and she said, "Excuse me, I saw what happened to you back there, and I was filming it. Do you want me to send you the video?" And it was a strange encounter, because most of the encounters I was having with people like Nadia in those days were because they wanted help to get out. Yeah. And they saw foreigners for, not unfounded reasons, had the ability to make that happen. And so it was very strange to be actually offered something from an Afghan at this point. And so I gave Nadia my business card and said, "Oh, there's my WhatsApp number, and send it there." And that was that. And then over the coming days, we were in touch a little bit, but it was really hectic times, and my phone, like all my friends and everyone that had any involvement in Afghanistan for the past 20 years, my phone was just going berserk with correspondence and people asking for help and asking to facilitate others that needed help and things. And so Nadia's messages ended up just getting lost in this massive of communication. And it wasn't until maybe a week or two later that a friend of hers got through to me. Nadia had given her my number, and she told me that Nadia was in trouble. And again, I was kind of skeptical. I thought, oh, this is, probably making up a story to try and that I would sympathise with and want to help her. And but eventually, and I can't remember exactly how it happened, but there was enough. I was given enough information that I realised that Nadia's situation was actually really precarious, and I found out a little bit more about that situation, and it that ends up being what I write about a lot in the book, about her experience, which led up to this point. And do you want me to?
I think, well, part of it was that her family was at risk with the Taliban taking over, and this is a condensed version, and then to settle that situation, they were going to hand her over as a bride to the Taliban, and she didn't want to. And so I suppose we won't wreck the storyline from the book, but it's these type of experiences that are just, it's frightening, and I just felt really sorry for her. Like what a courageous young woman, and just standing up for her rights. But it was precarious a position, wasn't it? When she reached out to you,
and horrifying the things that she went through and would go through, in the weeks to come, and really unthinkable when it's this kind of violence is coming from your own family.
Yeah, and I found it interesting, and it's a mark of the type of person that she is, that she still understood where her family were coming from, even though this violence was being inflicted on her. She still understood why, and that was the nature of the complexity of that conflict in Afghanistan.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, she exemplifies a lot of her story brings out a lot of the nuances and complexities, as you say.
There's another person in the book, Captain Armin Malik. I just felt sorry for him. He just seemed like a man of integrity. And do you want to tell us a little bit about his story?
Yeah, he was a young soldier who grew up in northern Afghanistan in a area that was historically pretty anti-Taliban, and he in the post-2001 era, he really just wanted to he'd grown up very poor, and he wanted to start a business in Kabul, and he first came to Kabul after the American invasion and was looking for work, and ended up enrolling in the military. And because he had an uncle who was quite senior and gave him a decent job, it's quite it's often how it works in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And he got a decent job, and as part of his job, he was around. He was helping to facilitate international travel for training courses for very elite Afghan forces. And so he was around some of these elite soldiers, and he thought, "Oh, I'm kind of into this. This is what I want to do." And they got their salaries were much higher, and they were given a lot more responsibility, and they got overseas training and education, and so he applied to become a part of this KKA, it was called, and ended up being a personnel officer with this unit, which was, in the end, the unit he worked for was one of the highest or the most elite units in the country.
Yeah.
And he was in a situation on August 15th where he was at his base in Kabul, which they used to share with the CIA, who was mentoring and training and operating with them, but who had left in the months prior as part of the withdrawal. And so he and several hundred of these elite soldiers were at their base, and basically putting out spot fires throughout the night before, going to try and secure the prison that had been broken out, and then in the end, being told
at this point in time, their mission was, or their role was, to resist the Taliban at this stage.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
they hadn't been told to look after yourself, get out of here at this stage.
Not at all, and they still had elements of their units around the country, fighting really really vicious battles in efforts to maintain control of some of these last remaining provincial capitals. But they were pretty fragmented by this point. They had some sort of marooned here, others there, hoping to get flights back to Kabul before they were overrun by the Taliban and things. And in the end, late on August 15th, they were ordered to go to the airport to help to secure the airport. And so the area that they had started out wanting to try and maintain security over at the beginning of the day just slowly shrunk. Yeah.
And I found that one part that you could see the type of person he was. He was obeying his orders, and a lot of people were abandoning their posts for understandable reasons. I'm not sitting here and judging people, but even with the handover of the vehicles and the weapons, and he virtually there on his own, and sitting there still trying to protect 30 Humvee vehicles and all these firearms. And he gave them to the Americans, and then the Americans, when he wanted help just to get out of there, got caught up in their own stuff, and he was left to just strip his uniform off and get out. And it makes you understand why these people must feel like they're abandoned, like he did everything that he was supposed to do, and then just left for his own devices.
Very much so, and not only the Americans, but also his leaders in the Afghan National Army, who most of whom were flown out on those flights with the Americans or on other flights.
Yeah.
And he never really considered that. He was even offered a seat on one of those flights, but he didn't really consider it. His family was still in Kabul. And I think he probably regretted it pretty soon after he decided to try and maintain his life in Kabul.
Well, they're completely left to his own devices. And it wasn't just those who had served in the military, but their families were considered to be at risk too. So they were in a terrible situation.
Exactly, yeah.
When you were over there was that the suicide bomb that went off. That I think you went to the hospital and recorded it from there. What was the story there?
Yeah, that was at one of the several gates into the airport. This one was being controlled mostly by American Marines, and it was quite a focal point because of the huge numbers of people that were trying to use it to access the airport, and the horrific scenes that were happening as a result. I'd actually been there the day before to try and help someone who I'd been asked to help to get inside the airport, and we'd been there for several hours the night before the suicide attack that you mentioned. And
just on that, sorry, Andrew, because you mentioned the airport, and that's the images that a lot of us have in our minds, the chaos there, and we'll get back to the suicide bombing, but the chaos that surrounded the airport. Talk to us about that, because we think we've got trouble when baggage handlers go out on strike here. It was absolute chaos.
Yeah, I've never seen anything like it. It was, these extraordinary circumstances where all airline staff and airport staff, for obvious reasons, just abandoned ship on August 15th because they were totally overwhelmed by people coming into the airport because, first of all, the security forces that had protected it up until that point had fled. So the gates to the airport were wide open, and probably 8,000 to 10,000 people had flooded the airport that first night. and probably as many as another 10,000 came the next day, and the planes were open, but there were no pilots, no crew, no fuel, but the planes were being boarded nonetheless because they represented an out of Afghanistan. And so for a couple of days after that, between the American military who were trying to secure the inside of the airport and the Taliban who were trying to secure outside the airport, those tens of thousands of people inside the airport that were eventually stopped the airport functioning because they were on the runway and preventing planes from taking off or landing. And in some cases, as most of your listeners have probably seen, clinging to the airplanes as they were lifting off. Within a couple of days, that situation was brought under control. With only through the use of extreme violence and threats of violence from the parties involved. The Americans inside enlisted the help of another elite Afghan unit, a pretty notorious unit, to try and help clear the airport, and they did so with brutal force, using cars, army vehicles, just to, if people weren't clearing, and they were literally just running people down, shooting them if they weren't getting out of the way. But sure enough, they cleared the airport. Yeah. And so for the next 2 weeks, you had this situation where you had the inside the airport was controlled by the Americans and other international forces, and the outside controlled by the Taliban. And so you had this bizarre situation, and then the people caught in between trying to get in.
And those reports of people throwing children to soldiers or babies, and people in the open sewers trying to make their way to the airport, that's all what you were witnessing?
Yeah, and people were dying, people were getting shot, people were dying from exhaustion or being trampled to death.
Yeah.
Women were giving birth, at these gates, and then handing babies over to soldiers in the hope of getting them through. Children were being handed over already dead. Yeah. It was just extraordinary circumstances. And as you said, at Abbey Gate, where this bomb went off, there was this sewerage canal that the Marines were using as a kind of buffer, like literally a moat, to help them sort through those that they wanted to let in and those they didn't. And this is where I came the night before to try and help this one individual and a family to get through that. I had been in contact with Australian officials on the inside of the airport, and they told me to get here and hand them over to the Australian soldiers. And so he spent basically a night trying to do that, and it never eventuated. Yeah. And then it was later that night I was told by the Australian officials to get out of there because they were getting threats of this suicide attack. Yeah. It didn't happen that night, but it happened at about 6 p.m. The night after. I was a long way from the airport at that point, but when I heard about it, I raced for the hospital, for one of the hospitals that I knew would be treating a lot of these wounded.
And in the chaos that you've seen around the airport, then you see the results of that. Tell us what the aftermath of a massive suicide bombing.
Well, this one was extreme because there were so many people there.
All crammed.
Yeah, all crammed in. And 170 Afghans were killed. 13 US service members were killed. A number of the Afghans, I found it very hard to verify this, but there were a lot of reports that the Marines had been shooting into the crowd after the initial attack because of the fear of a follow-up attack. And I certainly heard a lot of people make that accusation, but I found it pretty hard to substantiate in the end.
Right.
Yeah, but it was a huge, more than 180 people killed. The scene was just horrific. It was like this sewage canal was, was just full of bodies basically and body parts, and the hospitals were just inundated. It was horrific.
I think you talk about an environment like that, and it literally is. It's almost impossible to comprehend what was going on there. And you think these are people, these are normal people, and this is what they're experiencing. So, yeah, I don't know what to say to it. It must have just been a horrific experience.
Yeah, it's hard to. I mean, I wasn't there when it happened, but it was certainly watching them coming in, arriving at the hospital. It was, I'd seen a lot of scenes like that before, but this was just like a conveyor belt of people arriving in ambulances. And
there was a photo that you took. I think you got an award for it. The man on the operating table. Was that from that, or was that another incident?
No, that was from several years earlier. Yeah. That was again, that was taken in a hospital, but that hospital had been attacked by an American aircraft, actually, which had supposedly mistaken it for a building that was under control of the Taliban, but was in fact a functioning hospital and resulted in the deaths of more than 40 people, one of whom was this man who was being operated on at the time, and who was under general anaesthetic, splayed out on the operating table when the attack began, and the surgeons and medical staff who were operating on him at the time had no choice but to leave him where he was and find cover themselves.
Yeah, there's plenty of other stories in your book. There was the group of prisoners that were released, escaped, however you want to describe it, but when the guards walked off. But it had chaos. And then there was 9 of them, I think, that was picked up, and then I think they were found deceased. Is that a fair thing? So there's all these potential things happening from different sides, different perspectives. I think our friend Malik is talking about seeing soldiers being abducted and put into boots. Just bundled in the boots of cars. So there's chaos, isn't there?
Yeah, there's chaos, and everyone who was there at the time has incredible stories to tell. And I mean, for the book, in the end, it was really a matter of just choosing whose stories I wanted to tell, because I could have written that book probably 1,000 times over based on
everyone's got a story like that. How has it changed your? How long did you stay there before you left?
I stayed there another couple of months, basically doing interviews and research for the book.
Yep.
I left, about 10 weeks after the Taliban came back, and to come back to Australia and write the book. And then I went back there in April this year, May, to pack up my things and leave for good.
How did you find it going back? Had it changed?
Yeah, it had changed a lot. Yeah. I barely recognised the city anymore, and I found myself having to ask the kind of questions that most people would come to me asking about the city, about the country beforehand, based on the knowledge that I'd built up over many years, but which I'd lost in that period of change, because the people who were in control were all new. A lot of the vast majority of the people I had known in the past had all left, and even for working there, I relied heavily on translators and drivers and what we call fixers, the people who set up interviews and help us navigate the battlefields and so on. The vast majority of them had left, so that all the network that I'd built up was gone.
So it sounds like you're describing yourself again like a foreigner in what was your home.
Yeah, very much so, very much so. And not to mention all my friends that again, most of whom had left in that time.
Yeah. When you left after the couple of months coming back to Australia, how was it coming back to an environment like this, coming from an environment that you just experienced?
Yeah, it was. I had misunderstood what that experience, that transition would be like. I thought, I'm coming back to Australia, everything will be comfortable and I'll be with my friends and it's safe and I'll be able to enjoy walking down the street and, going for a swim in the afternoon, all the things that we sort of take for granted here. But I didn't really consider the lack of purpose that I'd have when I came back, because the work I'd done in Afghanistan for so many years was really part of my identity by that point. Whereas back here, I didn't really have an identity, and I didn't really feel motivated to try and take on the same kind of work that I'd been doing over there here, and so I felt very out of sorts, and still do to an extent. I don't really know where I fit in, and I'm still trying to work that out.
I think you've got to accept how much impact that would have on you. Those experiences to you're naive to walk away and think that it's not going to have an impact.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was naive, I think, and even just leaving that stuff behind, I think, has an impact. I mean, I think in many ways it would have been easier if I just continued going on and maintained that sort of that higher level of intensity and stress and
Yeah, because then you don't have time to think about it.
Exactly.
You just keep rolling along.
Keep going.
I saw that you went to a 10-day meditation retreat where you don't talk. I've had friends go there, and they haven't experienced what you've experienced, and it played with their mind. How was that, like going for 10 days and not speaking to anyone? It wasn't the not speaking part that I found difficult. It was more the 10 hours of meditation a day that I found pretty challenging. Yeah. I can be pretty happy in my own company, so the remaining quiet wasn't too big of a challenge. But that I mean, getting up at 4:30 every day to meditate for 2 hours before you've eaten breakfast, and 5 hours before 11 a.m. It's pretty full on. Seeing you in an uncomfortable position sometimes, or
but very, very worthwhile all the same. Yeah.
It's good that you took the time to do that. Plans for the future, or is it too early?
Yeah, I'm still working that out. I'm working on a book of photographs from Afghanistan. Yeah. That'll keep me busy for the next few months, but at the moment, I think I kind of want to take this time just to sort of sit with the experience over the last few years and let it let it soak in a bit, and try and come to terms with it, work out a little bit who I am, and hope some inspiration comes for what I want to do next. But apart from doing the book, nothing's really struck me yet. I'm sort of a little bit low on motivation and inspiration. But as a freelance journalist, I've been in that situation before, and you think, I'm never going to write another story. I'm never going to take another photo. But sure enough, some inspiration strikes, and I'm sure it will in this case as well.
Find some purpose. It's do you look back at what happened in Afghanistan, and are you angry that this was allowed to happen? Do you allow yourself to have those thoughts? Are you pissed off with people? How did this happen?
Yeah, I think that's probably passed a bit, because it was so inevitable for so long. In the end, it happened a lot more quickly than myself or anyone expected, a return to the Taliban. But I think, almost from the time I first arrived there, nearly 10 years ago, the writing was on the wall that this is probably the way it was going to go eventually. And, I think the test will come when the next situation arises that our governments have to consider our involvement in, and you could say that has already happened in Ukraine, and maybe it will happen in Taiwan in the years to come. But how we deal with it, I think the hawks would say that you can never rely on diplomacy to counter someone like Vladimir Putin or the Chinese Communist Party. But I mean, it seems to have failed, too many times under the watch of the Americans, not to consider whether it's the best or the only option.
The right way to go.
Mm.
And I think there's some reference in your book about whether it would have been better spent negotiating some control with the Taliban more than just sort of, no, you've got it from here.
Yeah, under Trump, who was in power at the time of the signing of the Doha Agreement, he just, I think he was way too worried about his re-election chances and wanted to sign this agreement with the Taliban regardless of how much leverage he was giving away. And so, as the Americans drew down their forces in Afghanistan, the less leverage they had against the Taliban to negotiate. And in the end, the Taliban could see that the Americans were leaving, and as they have all along, they've been very patient. They played the waiting game, and they when it came to the Doha Agreement, they saw, look, all they had to do then was wait, and it was a very finite period of time that they had to wait, and they weren't worried about domestic political imperatives like Trump was. He just wanted to get reelected and wanted to show the voters that he was going to end the war in Afghanistan regardless of the consequences it had for Afghanistan.
And that should be the last thing that motivates decisions.
Exactly.
Crucial
Exactly.
Well, look, in the short time that I've known you, but preparing for this podcast, you come across as a very humble, understated type of guy. So, and even the look that you've given me just then when I've said that, you've won the Gold Walkley, 9 times Walkley Award winner. I haven't been long in journalism, but I know it's something that people strive for. So, congratulations on that. But what I want to say to you, you've put yourself at risk. And you've explained the reasons why, but the important role that you carry out by putting a spotlight on the things that happen that you saw over there in Afghanistan, that without people like you taking the risks that you take and bringing it back to us, we'd never know. So thanks for your services there. And I don't know, there's something about that tells me you're going to find a passion for something, and you'll be doing something in the future. But thanks so much for coming on I Catch Killers.
Fingers crossed. Thanks a lot, Gary.
Cheers.